Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about the main villain of Season 3 of Star Trek Picard, the guy who is giving orders to the Changelings, who is probably not a Changeling himself because the way he talked with her, talking about her people being expendable and all of that, so it sounds as if he's not a Changeling himself, but someone who is giving them orders. And for some reason he wants Jack Crusher delivered to him alive for some reason, and I made a whole separate video on Jack Crusher and why he's so special. And in short, I theorized that maybe he has traveler powers like Wesley, or maybe it's because he has the genetics making him compatible for an anaphasic life form to take him as a host, just as Beverly's entire family was used as hosts by that ghost from the episode Sub Rosa, so maybe Jack has the same unique biochemistry that makes him the perfect host for such creatures. And I theorized that maybe Suspiria from Voyager, the female caretaker, who was always interested in people with psychic powers like the Okampa, maybe she's interested in Jack Crusher, but apparently the entity who is giving him visions is actually protecting him from the Changelings, so it cannot be the same entity that is giving orders to the Changelings, so it seems to be like two opposite powers struggling over Jack Crusher. Each of them wants him for themselves. So one possibility is that the wormhole aliens from Deep Space Nine, the Prophets and the Pares are fighting each other in another round, using humans as their pawns. Just like we saw in Deep Space Nine, they are able to possess people and their eyes turn red when a Pares is inhabiting someone. And in the scenes when Jack is having his visions, his eyes also turn red. But I personally don't want it to be about them again, because I didn't really like that storyline from Deep Space Nine. It was kind of too fantastical, kind of too religious for my taste, like angels versus demons. I prefer something a little bit more grounded and scientific. I don't mind the occasional fantastical things, but when you start going bigger and bigger with godlike entities fighting each other, then it begs the question, why do they even need the humans in this game at all? So I don't want them to go too fantastical. So let's go back to some simpler possibilities. First of all, when I first saw that scene of Vadic cutting off her own hand, which then turned into that goo that floats in the air and talks with her, I kind of assumed maybe she's not a full changeling. Maybe she's a human who got injured and that's why she has the facial scars still, and maybe a changeling found her and saved her and she made like a deal with the devil with him. So maybe it's a symbiotic relationship, kind of like Venom from Spider-Man, that this changeling is keeping her alive for some reason. Maybe they needed her knowledge, her expertise on something, and that's why she's working for them. And when that entity was talking with her, it told her it would be suicide to refuse him, so maybe he can simply leave her body and then she'll die from her injuries because that changeling is the only thing keeping her alive. So that was my initial thoughts when I saw that scene. I thought she's not fully a changeling, she's only part changeling somehow. But the more I thought about it and the more was revealed about these changelings, I realized she is probably a full changeling and that is some other entity entirely, because it keeps telling them things like your people, your ship, so it's like he's not one of them. And the fact that in that scene they first had to leave the nebula to make that transmission implies that the entity is not part of her. If it was part of her, why disconnect it at all? She could simply talk with her hand directly. Why the need to disconnect it and put it on a special plate to communicate with someone? And also the fact she had to cut the hand off with a knife, that's what confused me at first, because previously in Deep Space Nine, changelings were able to disconnect parts of themselves at will without having to physically cut it with something. By the way, that knife she used is the same knife that Shinzon had in Nemesis, and it actually originated from the TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer. That's when we first saw that knife, so it's interesting why she's using it. So later they explained that these are new types of changelings which can mimic humans more perfectly, and so maybe that makes them less liquidy, less agile, and so they're more meaty, and that's why it's harder for them to disconnect parts of themselves possibly. Or maybe the writer simply forgot about the previous changeling abilities. So anyway, obviously she is a changeling and is talking to someone who is not a changeling but someone more powerful than them. So who is that guy and why are the changelings obeying him? If they consider themselves a master race and all of that, if they always talked about themselves as if they're so superior, so why the hell would they obey someone who's not even one of them? And one interesting idea I have is that maybe that's actually Armus from TNG, the entity that killed Tasha Yar. who I always felt is kind of similar to the founders in many ways. Like he's also a liquid, which in his normal shape is like a puddle on the planet, and if he wants to, he can shapeshift and become humanoid. And his backstory is that a race of titans whose beauty now dazzles anyone who sees them basically expelled him. They tried to get rid of everything that was evil and nasty about themselves, and it created a second skin and became its own entity. And then they discarded him and left him on a desolate planet. So I always thought that race of titans might be the Changelings, the founders from Deep Space Nine, who did look kind of pretty in their natural shape in that show, not so much in this one, where they just look like someone puked a piece of meat or something. So I always felt like that backstory of Armus might be connected with the Changelings. And also Armus expressed his desire to find his people, the ones who left him there, the ones who discarded him, that he wants to find them and possibly reunite with them. And we also know that he's actually more powerful than a normal changeling, because he had all those energy abilities. He can kill people with a glance, he can teleport people, he can create force fields, he is resistant to phaser fire. So he's actually more powerful than the changelings, maybe because he has a kind of denser mass than them. That's why he cannot mimic humans as well, but he does have all those other abilities. Also, I think it would make sense that some of the changelings would want to obey someone like Armus, who used to be one of them, compared to if they just were following orders of some other alien or a human, which will make less sense since they always consider themselves so superior. Why would they be taking orders from a solid who they view as inferior? But maybe it's some other entity who is not humanoid, someone more powerful than the changelings, and I don't want to go with some super powerful beings like the Q or something like that, because that will be too powerful. Why would the Q need a group of changelings or a ship to do his bidding? A Q can just do anything by itself. So that's why I don't want it to be too powerful. Or maybe some entity that is somehow limited or trapped somewhere, sort of like that god entity from Star Trek V, who needed the help of a starship to get him out of his prison. Maybe he was imprisoned by some other powerful entities, and so he couldn't get out on his own, and so he was telepathically communicating with Spock's brother to try to get him to rescue him from that place. Maybe it can be something similar. Maybe some energy entity is trapped somewhere and needs their help to break it out. So also the Pares are technically also trapped in the fire caves. Or maybe it's some other entity such as Nagilum, for example. Nagilum was an entity in season 2 of TNG who trapped the Enterprise in kind of a hole in space from which they couldn't escape. They were trapped like in another dimension, and he was playing games with them, doing like lab tests on them and killing some of them off to see how they die, to learn about death, because he's immortal. And in the end, he simply let them go from his own goodwill. He didn't have to. He could have killed all of them, but didn't want to. So he wasn't fully evil, and there was no indication that he wants to take over the galaxy or stuff like that. He was simply being curious. So it was implied that he's not really fully evil. And he didn't seem trapped, he seemed to simply exist in some other dimension and doesn't seem to need anything. And so that's why I don't really think it's going to be Nagilum, but it's also a neat idea in my opinion. And also, why would Nagilum need or want Jack Crusher for? It could make sense if it's simply some kind of anaphasic life form, another ghost creature that simply wants to use Jack Crusher as its new host, or maybe it's because Jack Crusher has the Traveler abilities, and there seems to be two opposing forces, because the entity communicating with Jack Crusher seems to be protecting him from the Changelings. It was giving him premonitions and preparing him to defend himself against the Changelings. So there seems to be two different entities fighting over him. So maybe it's one of them is Suspiria from Voyager, who was always interested in humanoids with psychic abilities like the Ocampa. But then if they do that, then they have to bring Janeway back somehow. They did mention Janeway a few times in this season, so maybe there will be a surprise appearance and some kind of final confrontation against Suspiria, who might be the good entity, because remember in Voyager she kind of also let Voyager go in the end. She was not fully evil. You know, that's one of the things I used to like in the old Star Trek shows, that even the villains were not fully evil. They had different layers to them. Sometimes they did bad things simply out of curiosity or a misunderstanding, but by the end they reached some kind of mutual understanding and then left in peace and all of that. That's something I actually liked in the old shows, which wasn't just good versus evil, black and white, but it was much more complex a lot of times, and that's something I wish they will bring back. And maybe they'll go with a simpler explanation. Maybe the entity who is communicating with the changelings is actually a normal alien. Maybe it's future guy that we saw in Enterprise. That's another loose end which they never finished explaining. That's something that always annoyed me. They kept teasing us with that mystery of who that guy is, the guy who's communicating with the Suliban in the past. He's himself from the far future, and is trying to manipulate galactic history and use the Suliban as his soldiers. And remember that he genetically modified the Suliban to improve them, to enhance them. So maybe he's now doing the same thing with the Changelings. Maybe that can explain how they modified themselves to be more efficient at infiltration. And you know, Future Guy was also communicating with the Suliban while standing on some special plate, which then turns into that image. So maybe it's actually Future Guy trying to manipulate galactic history again, and this time using this group of changelings to do it and giving them biological modifications to improve their efficiency. So it might be nice to finally reveal who that guy was, but on the other hand, it again begs the question, why would changelings take orders from a humanoid solid? And so it makes less sense than the non-corporeal entities like Nagilum or the godlike entity from Star Trek V, who, by the way, I theorize might be one of the Cytherians. Those are the entities that the TNG crew encountered when they went into the center of the galaxy, the same area of space that Kirk somehow got to in Star Trek V. They never explained how they traveled that distance. But when they went to the center of the galaxy, they met that godlike creature who is basically like a giant floating head. And when the Picard and crew met the Cytherians in the center of the galaxy, they were also giant floating heads. But they seem to be good ones. They seem to be simply curious and wanting to bring others to them simply to learn about them. But maybe the one from Star Trek V was one of them, but a criminal whom they locked away on that planet as punishment. And maybe they created that barrier to protect others from him. So maybe there are more evil ones from that species out in the galaxy. Maybe one of them is communicating with the changelings. But again, I think that will be kind of overpowered, and maybe a simpler explanation is better. And another idea I have, and this will sound silly, but hear me out. Remember how the Enterprise's computer once became sentient after the ship went through some space anomaly, and suddenly the ship's computer became like a life form, and it was using the holodeck as the center of its nervous system, and so all the characters in the holodeck were like the subconscious of that entity. And in the end of the episode, the ship created some kind of new life form which left the ship and went flying out into space. And then Data asked Picard, why did you allow that life form to leave? Maybe it will be dangerous. And Picard says that that life form contains all of our knowledge, our logs, our experiences, our holodeck programs. Maybe it will be an honorable creature. And the more I think about it, the more ridiculous that idea is, because just imagine the kind of holodeck programs most people probably have been running, and that creature remembers all of that. Just imagine the kind of twisted, perverted thing it will be. And let's take just one example. Remember all the training programs that Worf was running in the holodeck, always fighting monsters and killing them. And there was one specific one that looked kind of like Skeletor, who Worf always killed in his programs. Imagine how many times he killed that guy. What if that hologram actually became sentient, kind of like Moriarty did, you know, with all the times that the holodeck malfunctions and created sentient creatures? Imagine if that Skeletor guy actually became sentient, maybe because of that event when the ship computer became self-aware and became its own creature and all of that. So what if that Skeletor guy, who remembers being butchered and mutilated and killed by Worf thousands of times, what if he became sentient? What if he remembers all that was done to him on the holodeck? You know, there was an episode in Voyager where holograms who became sentient kind of rebelled against their creators and escaped on their own ship, and they were calling themselves photonic life forms. And by the way, in this show, when they first scanned the villain ship, the Shrike, they said there's some photonic activity on that ship, so that might also be a clue. So anyway, imagine if that Skeletor guy remembers all the time that Worf killed him and mutilated him. Maybe he's super angry about it and wants revenge against Worf and against Starfleet, who put him through that torture. Maybe he was one of the entities, one of the holographic photonic life forms that escaped inside that little device that was created. So maybe that holodeck character simply wants revenge against Starfleet. And you know, when that face appeared to Vadic, it did kind of look like a skull, so it is very similar to the Skeletor guy from Worf's training program. Maybe he will unite forces with Moriarty, who is also a victim of the Enterprise crew, whom they lied to. They told him he can never leave the holodeck and imprisoned him in a fake reality forever, when just a few short years later they have mobile emitters and they have synthetic bodies. and Picard got himself a synthetic body, and Raffi is using a mobile emitter, and yet they still left Moriarty to rot in a fake simulation. So maybe all these holograms who hate Starfleet for all of these reasons, united forces, and the Skeletor guy is especially angry because of all the times he got killed in the holodeck, and maybe Lore joined forces with them because he's also an AI who's been mistreated by humans and imprisoned by them, so maybe Lore wants freedom from the biologicals. But why would Changelings want to obey some evil AI programs who want to destroy all the biologicals when they themselves are also biological? So it doesn't really make much sense. So from all these different theories, I think the one about some more powerful entity such as Nagilum actually makes the most sense, but I am curious to see what the show will actually do, so I guess we'll wait and see. So all of this has been purely for fun, so I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you think and we can discuss all of this in the comments below. Please hit the like button, subscribe, click the notification bell if you want to see updates of new videos, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.